Now we jump into our first quantitative chapter. Chapter 3, looking at how online political engagement affected President Barack Obama's first election into office in 2008. We have four hypotheses that we're going to look at, and in the chapter they run four separate regression analyses on each hypothesis. And we'll break down how each of the variables are measured in a little bit. But first we're going to talk about the four hypotheses, what they are, what they mean. Then we're going to look at the results of each regression individually. We're going to interpret those findings. And then we're going to talk about the implications of those findings moving forward. And we're going to also talk about the generalizability of the findings. One of the big things we always want in political science, with quantitative analysis, with theory building, is to come to a conclusion that is generalizable, or at the very least, to understand that our findings are limited in scope. So what do we look at here? In particular, our four dependent variables, and each of the analyses is online political engagement. All right, so we're worried about how online political engagement works in relation to political interest, voting in a primary, voting in a general election, and offline political participation. And all of this is in the context of 2007, 2008, running up to the election of President Obama. And this was a very unique place and time. But we don't want to spoil it too much. We will get there very soon. Now we have our first regression analysis results we'll look at. And I'll preface it real quickly by saying, if you need to brush up on your scopes and methods, there is a PowerPoint that I made that's on lecture forum number 4 that I suggest you go over, and it helps you with what to look for, what's important when looking at a regression analysis. But always feel free to ask me questions. So, our first hypothesis, H1, increases in online political engagement should lead to an increase in political interest within an individual. That's what we're looking at. Online political engagement is our main theoretical independent variable. Independent because it has an independent effect on the dependent variable, which is political interest here. Now below you'll see a whole bunch of other variables too. We call these control variables. In order for the numbers to work properly, you have to populate your regression with a given number of control variables to try to replicate what the real world looks like. So here we see that it's not just online political engagement matters. We see several other variables also affect a person's likelihood of their political interest increasing. Other variables, like in this one you see being male. This is just the way that the authors worded gender. Okay, so in here they see in their numbers that being male for some reason led to an increase in political interest in an individual. Now we're going to see this time and time again in a lot of different countries. And you would rightfully ask the question, well, why would being male have anything to do with interest in politics? And there is a pretty sad but realistic answer for that, and it's called patrimonialism. Patrimonialism is a society where it's dominated by men. The idea that politics is a male-dominated thing is nothing new. This year marks 100 years that women have gained the right to vote. Before that, it was all men. If you look at government today, it's still dominant, male run. So it should not actually be surprising that we find a legacy of patrimonialism in our data. You know, theoretically, we all think that that's real, that it happens out there. It only makes sense that it shows up in our numbers. And the fact that it does show up in our numbers is, one, well, it's a sad thing because it means that it's actually true, but two, it's a good thing because it means our regression analysis is robust. We're picking up real world things, which really matters. Our next one, education. We find that as education increases, as well as income increases, this leads to an increase in political interest. Now, why would going to school more, why would having more money make an individual more interested in politics? It could be several different reasons. But one of the biggest is probably the idea of how these two variables are connected. The more money and education you have, the more likely it is that you have assets or taxable income that will be directly affected by politics. For instance, tax policy. The more money you make, the more taxes are going to affect you. Therefore, you probably are going to pay attention to tax policy a little more. And you're going to vote for people based off of which tax policy is best for you. Okay, and then Democrat here comes up significant. And this is an interesting one, and you have to think about it once again in the context of the time of the election. Why would being Democrat make you more likely to be interested in politics? Well, perhaps these numbers, these findings are a ramification of that special election, the election of the first African American president. So Democrats, for the first time, were sending an African American to the White House, or hopefully so. So they were charged as a base. So they were more interested in politics, statistically speaking. And then reading newspapers and watching television. Why would these two have anything to do with political interest? A lot of it has to do with the fact that still the majority of the population of the U.S. get their news from TV and from newspapers. Now again, this is shifting, and we'll talk about that later in the semester. But it makes sense, though, that individuals are consuming their news via these media. Therefore, those are people who would become more politically interested. Now, that's just our first one, right? Our next few results we're going to go through rather quickly, and we're only going to go over the new additions of the independent variables that become significant. Now we move on to H3, hypothesis number 3. Wait, number 3? What happened to number 2? Hypothesis number 2 was that online political engagement would have a positive effect on the likelihood of increasing voter turnout in primaries. The authors found no evidence for that in 2008 and 2007, meaning that online political engagement had nothing to do with people showing up for primary elections. We're going to save why that is, but we're going to talk about that moving forward for sure. What we did find, though, is that the more politically engaged online an individual was, the more likely they were to go out and vote. Now that's a big finding. Increasing voter turnout is something in a democracy you theoretically always want to do. So if you know by increasing someone's online political engagement, you can increase voter turnout, well then your next question would be, how do you increase online political engagement? And then maybe you go back to the chapter before and maybe you think increase byproduct learning, do this or do that. We'll get there, don't worry. But some other variables that are new on this list is political interest. Our last dependent variable shifts over to being an independent variable. So the more interested you are in politics, the more likely you are to go out and vote. That makes sense. Also, we see being Republican shows up as significant on here, along with Democrat. Now, this is probably for one major reason. It's party identification. If you register as a Democrat, if you register as a Republican, it means you are ideologically aware of your self-placement. If you are aware of your own self-placement, it probably means you are into politics, and therefore, you are more likely to vote. In comparison to what? An independent. So that's just hypothesis 3. We have one more to go through, then the implications of it all. Our last hypothesis. As online political engagement increases in a person, so too will their offline political participation. Now, this is not voting, these are other things. But that's a pretty big finding. So if we can engage people online politically, then it will increase their offline political participation as well. That's pretty big. Perhaps that's what's going on in the US right now. People started being engaged online and that shifted over to offline. We'll talk about that more. We have the same other control variables that are significant, likely for the same reasons. There's one variable that I'm going to mention that I'm not going to go into a lot that is significant and new. It is the party candidate mobilization. This has to do with people going out, canvassing, working phones, standing with signs. There's a methodological issue here called multicollinearity. I don't want to go into it too much today because we will jump into it a whole lot more moving forward. But just know that, in my opinion, there's a methodological issue with this one variable. Therefore, I'm going to throw it out for now. But again, we'll come back to multicollinearity. The interesting new variable that we see that has a negative effect is age. So how do we interpret a variable with a negative effect? Simple. As age decreases, this leads to increasing in offline political participation. So let's think about that. The younger you get, the more likely you are to participate in offline politics. Well, we know younger people don't participate in politics as much as older people do. But how is this variable offline political participation measured? Remember, we're not talking about voting here. So this relationship seems counterintuitive, but only because we don't know yet how we're measuring our dependent variable, which is exactly why next we're going into the measurements for our variables, and we're going to talk about why it is so important in all of these chapters that you have to read and see what these variables, how they are measured, so you know what implications we can actually take from regression analysis. So this is really the only chapter that I'm going to break down variables like this for you. In all the other chapters, the assumption will be that you know how these variables are measured, so you can know how to interpret them. So in our first hypothesis, it's as online political engagement increases, this leads to an increase in political interest. Now, we already talked about political interest. You can just ask people their interest in politics, 0 to 10. But how are you measuring online political engagement? What are you really saying? Well, there are 4 variables. This is called the components variable. And you have frequency of visiting a news site, frequency of visiting political blogs, posting comments on a news or political site, and exchanging political emails with friends or family. Now, some of these seem a bit passé, but they have modern equivalents too that we're going to talk about in the forum. Like an email. Yeah, people don't pass political emails that much anymore, but they surely do message each other. So once again, there are equivalents we can switch to. So how do we interpret this? We are saying the more you visit news sites, the more you visit political sites, the more you comment on political things, the more emails or messages you send your friends about politics, the more you do that stuff online, the more your political interest will increase. Well, hey, whenever I look at it that way, that does kind of make sense. You know, the more I do all of these political things online, the more my interest in politics will grow. So once again, the question is begged. Well, if all of this is a good thing, if people being interested in politics is a good thing for democracy, how do we increase online political engagement? Now let's look at hypothesis 3 and think about how online political engagement is measured and how that equates to increasing voter turnout in the general election. What our finding is suggesting is that as people frequent news sites, as people frequent political blogs, as people post comments, as people send messages and emails, as people do that more and more online, they are more likely to turn out and vote. Is that an important finding? I think you could very quickly argue yes, especially with global current conditions as they are, and more people being forced online. That is a different avenue, that is a different variable that we didn't know about that would come, that has caused an increase in online political engagement. Theoretically, from this finding, that should mean that come November of an election year, voter turnout should be increased, perhaps quite significantly. Now we look at our last hypothesis. As online political engagement increases, going to a news website, political website, commenting on political blogs, sending a political message to someone you know, as you do those things will lead you to more offline political participation. Now, what does that mean? You have to look, because in different chapters, they describe this and define it and measure it differently than this chapter. In this chapter, it means donating money. It means wearing a button for a candidate, discussing a candidate with someone, and going to see a candidate speak. So as you The whole hypothesis, all the numbers, all the measures, what we are saying here, as you visit a news website, political website, comment on blogs, or send political messages, doing those things make you more likely to wear a button, donate money, talk about a candidate, or go see a candidate speak. That's the relationship. Online political engagement leads to increases in offline political participation, the way those variables are measured. In 2007, 2008, in the US. You cannot assume those findings and those measures will work the same in a different country or even necessarily in a different election. But here, at this time and place in the US, we have found that online political engagement mattered a whole lot in the 2008 election of President Barack Obama. Now let's wrap it all together and see why that is and how important is it. Real-world implications of our findings. A question we always need to ask. Does it matter? We have found that the 2008 election of President Barack Obama, that online political engagement led to increases in political interest, led to increases in voter turnout, and led to increases in offline political participation. Are these big findings? Yes, they are. Why? Because the country is a democracy. A democracy is predicated off of the simple idea, government by the people. Democratus, that's what that means. In a democracy, for it to function properly, you need the people involved. If you have low voter turnout rates, you start to question how democratic your country is. So theoretically, increasing voter turnout rates, increasing political participation, online, offline, political interest, these things matter for the quality of your democracy. And if you know what variables can increase those qualities that you want, then you can work on improving the quality of democracy overall in your country. So yeah, the implications of these findings are huge. However, we need to ask, are these findings generalizable? And theoretically, we would say, sure they are. All the things I just said theoretically work. Theoretically, they should be generalizable to all elections. But is this election generalizable? Is there anything special about this election? Yeah, a whole lot. Let's start. So, number one, you're just coming off of 2 terms of a Republican president. Generally speaking, history has shown us whenever you have a presidency that has been 2 terms, one party, it almost always switches to the next party. Okay? You have to take that into account. Also, this is not long after 9/11. We had gone to war in Iraq. We had gone to war in Afghanistan. The country was in a state of war fatigue with the Republican Party. Okay, that's pretty special circumstances. Also, you had a candidate who was doing extremely well and got the nomination for one of the parties to be the potential first African-American president of the entire country ever in history. Yeah, that's a pretty special circumstance. Anything else going on in the world? 2008-ish? Oh, wait, what's that? That global recession? Yeah, that's kind of a special case too, isn't it? And there's even more we could talk about that would make this one election a special case. And with numbers, methodologically speaking, with regression analysis, we would call this case an outlier because of all the special asterisks we would put next to it. Now, granted, it fits with trends that we see in other elections. But still, we need to take the context of the time that this data was collected and this analysis was run and what was going on in the world at that moment. So our findings are important. What we need to do from here is to test them in other places, in other elections, and see if we find similarities with our results.